Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second WCED Flashpoint panel of the year. This one is on Lebanon. I'm really excited to be here with you all despite the difficult circumstances. I'm glad that you all could make the time for the panel and that our panelists could make the time to be here with us. If you're like me, you're probably finding it quite difficult to turn away from the train wreck that is modern American politics, but for the next hour and a half, we're going to do our best to set those concerns aside and focus on Lebanon. So for those who don't know me, I'm Matthew Cebul. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, WCED, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So we're very grateful to be hosting four excellent panelists who I will very briefly introduce. Christiana Parreira is a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies and a Stanford PhD. Her dissertation focuses on Lebanese governance and distributive politics, which I believe we'll hear more about today. Sarah Parkinson is an associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. Sarah has written a number of illuminating articles on rebel organizations and Lebanese politics from an ethnographic perspective that is, in my opinion, sorely needed in political science. Lama Mourad just began her first semester as assistant professor of international affairs at Carleton University and was formerly a fellow at Perry Worldhouse at UPenn and Harvard's MEI. She researches migration and border politics, especially in the Middle East. And lastly, Jean Lachapelle is a postdoctoral fellow at the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg. And Jean was formerly a WCED postdoctoral fellow like me, working on repression in autocratic regimes. So I don't really want to belabor these introductions in the interest of time, other than to say that these are all tremendous scholars from whom I've personally learned quite a lot, and I expect this panel today will be no different. So the format, we're hoping to have lots of time for Q&A, so I will attempt to keep presentations as moderator around 10 minutes in length. I believe that Derek has already put in the chat function for you all to see that if you want to ask questions, there's a Q&A chat function. You will type them to me and then I will curate them and help ask them during the Q&A session. You should feel free to type those questions at any time during the presentation. Don't wait for the Q&A session. I can kind of grab them and organize them as I go. I believe that is all we need to cover to start. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christiana.
Thank you so much, Matt, for moderating, and the University of Michigan for hosting this great event. So today I'll be talking specifically about the local origins and implications of Lebanon's governance crisis. And much of what I'll be talking about is based on dissertation research that I conducted between 2016 and earlier this year. So I want to start with some simple descriptives that I think illustrate the failure of the recent Lebanese governments to provide the basic welfare goods with which we often associate states. So for example, overall infrastructure quality in Lebanon, according to a recent McKinsey report, was ranked 113th out of 137 countries. Electricity provision is ranked 4th worst in the world. Those who have spent any time in Lebanon will wonder why it is not ranked 1st worst in the world. And the country spends an average 7 times per ton of trash on waste management than neighboring Syria or Jordan, despite the fact that those services remain highly inadequate. And we see similarly dire figures in other realms of public goods provision, including health, education, and social protection. And so what I want to do in this presentation is to present a specifically local understanding of how the Lebanese government has been able to govern so poorly while also suffering so few, as of up until now, electoral consequences. So what exactly is Lebanon a case of? What is its national regime a case of? After 2005, or since 2005, Lebanon has almost always been governed by what's referred to in the social science literature as a party cartel. Party cartels are conceptually identical to national unity governments, and they're often formed in Latin America and elsewhere in the aftermath of political violence in order to facilitate elite cooperation and prevent what are seen as problematic forms of elite competition. And these party cartels perform much like economic cartels that people are familiar with, like OPEC. They limit the supply of goods being produced, and in this case, the goods being produced are governance goods. But that being said, the Lebanese state is not like an economic cartel in the sense that people have the ability to vote their representatives out of power. Lebanon has been, since 2005, a free and fair electoral democracy. So why do we see so little anti-cartel electoral competition? To illustrate, in the latest national elections, reformists won only 1 out of 128 seats, despite competing in almost every district, and less than 5% of the popular vote in almost all districts. So prior explanations for this discrepancy between the regime's behavior and people's electoral preferences focus on clientelism or people's valuing a sort of ascriptive identity-based form of representation over public goods provision. And what I want to argue is that while neither one of those explanations are necessarily incorrect, the lack of electoral competition can also be understood through another more institutional lens. What I've found in my research is that Lebanon's sort of party cartel regime rewards loyalty and punishes opposition on a communal basis through its relationships with local governments. Municipal governments in Lebanon are responsible for a variety of forms of service provision. And after the Civil War, the party cartel consistently has colluded in local elections, allying with one another against anti-cartel opponents. And the heavily centralized system of public administration that we see in Lebanon, much like we see in the rest of the Middle East, means that the party cartel can leverage its control of resources within the central state to effectively enable loyal municipalities to govern well and to make it impossible for others to do so. And in this way, over time, opposing the cartel through electoral opposition becomes an increasingly unviable strategy, and opposition is effectively eradicated at its local roots. And to illustrate, I present some data that I collected last year tied with data that I collected in collaboration with the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies shortly after the latest municipal elections. And what I find is that systematically across a variety of sectors of service provision, party cartel controlled municipalities see better governance than other areas. And this is true across measures like road quality on the right, administrative capacity on the left, and the holding of local town hall meetings. So lacking electoral means of effectively expressing opposition, people in Lebanon have increasingly turned to protest mobilization that reflects dissatisfaction with the entirety of the governing cartel. And these protests have been extensively documented, particularly in Beirut, and I'm sure other discussants will talk about them from different angles. But I want to zoom in specifically on what protests have looked like outside of Beirut in the urban periphery. So in late 2019, I was conducting a survey in Saida, which is Lebanon's third largest city. And in the middle of the survey, protests began. So in the post-protest respondent wave of about 300 respondents, I was able to ask about protest participation and assess the demographics of those who did versus did not protest. And what I find, much like protests that we've seen in other parts of the Middle East, is that protesters are overall younger, more educated, more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be men, and much less likely to have voted in the latest elections. They're also predictably less likely to belong to the dominant party cartel member represented in Saida, the Future Movement, and they're more likely to belong to a local, I would say, quasi-opposition party, the Popular Nasserite Organization, which is represented in parliament, but is not represented in the Council of Ministers. That being said, protesters and non-protesters have similar sectarian and socioeconomic demographics. So from fieldwork interviews and observation of the protests in 2019 and early 2020, I found that Saida represents an interesting and sort of prototypical example of protests at Lebanon's urban periphery. So early protests targeted, much like the rest of the country, much like other urban peripheral areas like Tripoli, targeted all of the local dominant political factions, specifically the Future Movement, led by Saad Hariri, and the Popular Nasserite Organization, led by current MP Osama Saad. That being said, really interestingly, the PNO leader, Osama Saad, despite being a member of parliament, joined the protests as early as the first night and began quickly to both publicly voice support for the protests, to go to them on a regular basis, and to act as a sort of parliamentary opposition. He didn't resign from parliament, but he did, for example, vote against the confirmation of Hassan Diab as prime minister. The Future Movement adopted a slightly different tactic. They are, of course, a core party cartel member. But later on in the protests, following their leader Saad Hariri's resignation as prime minister, they began to quietly encourage supporters to protest. And the municipality, which is controlled by the Future Movement, and which is sort of seen as the local manifestation of the Future Movement's power in the city, became a meeting space for protesters and began to host informational meetings that were widely regarded and widely attended. So what I want to suggest is that while these protests have been sustained and ongoing, and indeed unprecedented, there's also been a more complex interplay between the politics of all of them means all of them and the co-optation of these protests in subtle ways by parties that are seeking to stem reputational damage and recover some semblance of local support. So just to wrap up, obviously it's clear from those who have been following recent Lebanese politics that these techno-political government initiatives, first the government of Hassan Diab and the sort of dead-on-arrival government of Mustafa Adib, have been deemed illegitimate completely and thoroughly in the eyes of protesters. And in the aftermath of the port explosion, which I believe Professor Parkinson will be talking about, governance is now in a state of near total paralysis. And the escalating socioeconomic shocks that we've seen over the past year have certainly increased popular resentment against the cartel, but they've also bolstered its ability to leverage state control and remain in power, and indeed may have bolstered its resolve to do so. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing other people's presentations.
Thank you so much, Christiana. Just a couple quick things. This stuff about party co-optation of protest is fascinating. I can't wait to hear questions about that. And as a reminder for panelists, please feel free for attendees, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A chat. You can start now and I'll curate them as we go along. Okay, so next we have Sarah Parkinson.
Let me just share my screen. Okay. So I'd also very much like to thank Matt and Dan and everyone at the University of Michigan for making this possible. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and to hear what everyone else has to say. I want to be very clear where I'm coming from as I speak today. I'm going to speak to you today as someone who lived in Beirut for years as a researcher, whose Lebanese, Palestinian, and Syrian friends are suffering immeasurably in current circumstances, and who is still quite honestly struggling to process what has happened and what is continuing to happen to them. My goal is not to give you an overview of what has happened in Lebanon over the past year or the past decades. Lebanese scholars and activists have been exhausting themselves giving on-the-ground commentary, and their voices very much deserve to be central in this conversation. So what I am going to do is take a step back and talk about the Beirut explosion from two positions that I feel might add something to your perspective and to the conversation. The first is that of someone who is beginning to study disasters and who has recently trained as an emergency medical technician. And the second is as someone who currently lives in Washington, D.C. I want to make two specific points. One is about emergency response and the politics involved. And the second is about how external analysts treat places like Lebanon, and specifically Lebanon. Now, this is sort of a funny sentence to say in the context of what we think of as a political science or Middle East studies talk, but I'm not sure how much people in the audience might know about ammonium nitrate. My admittedly limited knowledge of hazardous materials comes from my EMT training, which is coincidentally where I was when the Beirut explosion happened. What I know from this training is that if I were deployed as a first responder in the US and recognized the Department of Transportation placard, which is UN 1942 Division 5.1, an oxidizer, at a fire scene, my job would be to get away from it as soon as possible. The Emergency Response Guidebook, which is the ERG, which is the key US reference for hazardous materials, notes that ammonium nitrate is not a fuel itself. Rather, it is mixed with fuels to add oxygen and to heighten an explosion. This is also why it's used in fertilizer. Ammonium nitrate accelerates burning and decomposes violently at high temperatures, like when it's exposed to fire, but it does not technically fall into the division for explosives, which is Division 1. The ERG notes that in the case of fire in a tank trunk, or a rail car carrying ammonium nitrate, a geographic area equivalent to 1,600 meters, or about 1 mile, should be evacuated, including all emergency responders. That, I should note, is under the rules of transport for ammonium nitrate in the US, which might, from what I can tell, include loads of between about 40 and 110 tons, but sort of look that up. I should not be quoted for that as the actual regulation. What's important to know here is that Hangar 12 in Beirut's port held 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. The 10 firefighters who were deployed to Warehouse 12 did not know this. Instead, the Carleton-based unit deployed to the fire under the impression that they were dealing with fireworks. If first responders, or for that matter, port workers in Beirut had known what they were dealing with, that is, if they had a shipping manifest, if the warehouse, not just the bags, were properly marked, then they would have known that for the quantity of ammonium nitrate that fits into one rail car, let's say approximately 100 tons, give or take, a mile radius around the Beirut port should have been immediately evacuated. And that's the ring that you see on your screen. And for those of you who know Beirut, you know how significant of an area that is. Indeed, the brigadier general who commands Beirut's firefighters told Al Jazeera, quote, "Had we known that there was this amount of explosive material in the port, we could have acted completely differently. We would have called for an evacuation of the area, and definitely we wouldn't have sent these young men and women in." I can't imagine what it is like from my extremely limited training in first response and incident command, what it is like to have to think through that had we had known for the rest of your life. First Lieutenant Raymond Farah told Al Jazeera's Timur Azari that when his team called in from the fire, they told him, "There's something wrong here. There is a crazy sound and a huge fire." Before Farah could deploy backup, exploding fireworks detonated the ammonium nitrate, effectively destroying Quarantina and entire neighborhoods of East Beirut. Every member of the firefighting unit on scene died. In an explainer published on ammonium nitrate on August 5th, the day after the blast, Scientific American notes that for an industrial ammonium nitrate explosion to happen, a lot needs to go wrong. I'd like to highlight here that while media accounts of the event repeatedly call ammonium nitrate an explosive, the language of explosive might actually mask just how much had to go wrong for 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate to decompose explosively in Beirut on August 4th. Plenty of reporting, including long-form pieces from the Arab Reform Initiative, Jadidiyya, and the New York Times has already detailed just how much went wrong over decades. So here, I'd like to turn instead to the usefulness of disaster studies and thinking through it. Disaster scholar Yarimar Bonilla uses the idea of aftershocks from obviously plate tectonics and earthquakes to frame the compounding effects of disaster after it happens in the context of state failure and social abandonment, two terms her interviewer, and this is in Public Inquiry, Ryan Cecil Jobson emphasizes. So as Bonilla explains, no disaster is a single event. They all carry aftershocks, those repetitive blows that are felt when state agencies fail, when disaster capitalism rolls in, when communities are displaced and trauma is compounded. What Bonilla's work allows us to do in the context of the Beirut explosion is to think about the temporality of disaster and the history of disaster, and to consider the explosion as an aftershock as well as a disaster in of itself. But what is it an aftershock of? It's worth noting that the port's status as a smuggling hub, for example, can be understood as an aftershock of the Lebanese civil war. In this sense, it's not just recent incompetence, mismanagement, and corruption that facilitated the explosion. It's a long history of treating the port's capacity to facilitate profit-generating illicit activities that matters. In my own work, which is predominantly on set in the Lebanese civil war, I spoke to Palestinian fighters who, following their expulsion from Beirut in 1982, returned through Beirut's port by paying the very militias that their groups were fighting $50,000 just to get a small Zodiac into the port. And these were, for example, the Lebanese forces in Kataib at the time. Lack of port regulation as an aftershock of both the confessional system initially put in place by colonial authorities and maintained with only minor reforms, and they're not really reforms, to be honest, by the Taif Agreement or following the Taif Agreement, following the Civil War, is something that we should all be considering. Second, I think it's worth noting, and I believe that Lama will probably talk about this a little more, that we could see racism and classism as an aftershock as well. Specifically, in the aftermath of the explosion, we've seen a great amount of blame levied on Syrian welders who were, quote, working too close to the ammonium nitrate, that they should have known better. Never mind the fact that they could never have known it was there, and that it shouldn't have been there, that it was improperly stored, and that it was unmarked. This is a narrative that's gained significant traction, not because of its actual importance in any sort of investigation, but in terms of the ways that it displaces blame and the fact that it heightens communal tensions at a time when many people are suffering. It is in of itself an aftershock of decades of Syrian occupation, exploitative labor practices, especially towards Syrian laborers in Lebanon over decades, and the recent Syrian civil war, which really is, having started in 2011, not so recent anymore. It's also worth noting that the sunken cargo ship that initially carried the ammonium nitrate into Beirut under a Moldovan flag, in this case, a flag of convenience, before it sank in dock, is in of itself directly tied to the international shipping regime, or to an international shipping regime that facilitates tax evasion and atrocious labor practices, as Lala Khalili has argued in The Guardian. It is initially, it's worth noting, a product of the failed policy of prohibition in the 1920s in the US. So just a way of thinking through and historicizing these disasters, or the idea of disaster and the explosion. Crisis is a regrettably familiar frame for Lebanon. Many of my colleagues in DC, or in Washington, DC specifically, might cynically suggest that Lebanon is never not in crisis, a stance it is worth noting that many Lebanese have criticized. The Beirut explosion was a disaster, but I would like to note that it is already a disaster when politicians are willing to send firefighters to certain death because they are concerned that their incompetence will be exposed if they were to do the only moral thing, which would have been to evacuate East Beirut. As I've written previously with Faten Gosen, it is also an ethical and intellectual crisis when people who have never been to Lebanon and do not regularly speak with non-elite Lebanese offer hot takes on the country's embedded sectarianism or Hezbollah and Amal's corruption, without situating the idea of embedded sectarianism in colonial legacies or noting Amal and Hezbollah's 1970s and 1980s emergence in response to vast social inequities and foreign occupation. Ironically, as any competent observer of Lebanon knows, these takes only allow Hezbollah to further justify its political stances, all while erasing the nuanced and quite plentiful domestic critiques to which it is subject. And for this, I want to actually point to this slide. RABIH ALAMEDDINE is a Lebanese novelist who wrote an op-ed the day after the explosion in the New York Times, and who specifically made a point to call out all of the Twitter hot takes. So I've included one of the posts that he specifically referenced. And then the point where he says, you know, so many of these are believable for some reasons, but that the reality of the Beirut explosion is so much more banal. The problem with the reality of the Beirut explosion right now is that it doesn't feed the kind of narratives that people want it to. And what I'd argue here is that pointing to Hezbollah when anything bad happens in Lebanon only gives the group the justification it needs to continue abusing the resistance narrative upon which it really relies so heavily. Indeed, recent writing in Jadaliyya, the Arab Reform Initiative, and the New York Times all emphasize the fact that all major parties have a presence at the port, have historically had a presence at the port, and have contributed to and benefited from its unregulated, ambiguous legal status. There is a reason why Lebanese protesters chant the slogan, "Kullun yani kullun," that is, all of them means all of them, to imply that anyone but all of them are responsible for this explosion, and for the 200 deaths and the 6,000 injuries that are associated with it, is to do a grave injustice to both people on the ground and to our understanding of these events. Statements that pose disaster and crisis as a natural state of affairs in Lebanon, rather than the product of decades of poor state policy, poor resource management, international interference, and systematic looting, dehistoricize and pathologize Lebanese populations. Hezbollah is only part of this story. To center it and to erase guilt from other parties that other parties have earned. I want to end this talk by calling for empathy for people who are trapped or who are trying to protest, not simply their own governments and party shortcomings, but also by narratives that simplify the challenges that they face in the name of scoring points in the name of scoring political points for policies that are developed outside of the region. I think that Lebanese populations are well aware that they deserve better than that. And as ALAMEDDINE and plenty of other commentators have noted, and here's my slide for that, very much deserve more. I'd also point out that people know that they don't have other options and that they're also trapped by an international migration regime that has been built to hold them where they are. So to accuse people in sort of their own, or to render people responsible for their own repression is, I would say, a miscarriage of where we should be pointing blame in this particular set of events. Thank you. Ooh, how do I stop sharing?
Thank you so much, Sarah. This idea of disaster capitalism, or maybe more broadly, just disaster politics in general, seems like a term that was just custom built for what's going on in Lebanon today, with parties attempting to exploit and leverage this crisis, and the Lebanese people are just stuck in the middle of that. Okay, so next we have Lama Mourad.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to Dan and Derek, and to Sarah and Christiana. I've loved hearing both of you. I was excited about this panel in large part also because of what I'd learned from my co-panelists, and this has definitely been the case so far. And I'm sure, Jean, you will not disappoint either, don't worry. So actually, Sarah's presentation kind of leads very well into the intervention that I'd like to make today. And for kind of the short presentation that I have, I'm going to focus on the ways in which the economic crisis, the blast, and the rapidly accelerating crisis of COVID-19 have affected and amplified existing inequalities in the country and have extended previous forms of securitized governance on particular populations in the country. So I'm going to focus specifically on migrant and refugee populations, but as Sarah pointed out, there are ways in which this intersects with class dynamics in the country and other kinds of intersectional identities, particularly racialized identities, that are worth talking about, but I'm going to kind of focus specifically on legal status and migrant and refugee populations. So I think kind of as a broad thinking, you know, even in a global context, when it comes to the challenges that COVID-19 in particular posed to migrants and refugee populations, we often think about and hear about you know, the greater vulnerability that migrants and refugees face with regards to the crisis, to the virus itself. And that's specifically in relation to, you know, the places that they live, their ability to practice physical distancing, lack of access to water, lack of access even to information about the virus and to its spread. But what I think is often missed in the ways in which this is talked about is also the ways in which legal regimes, forms of governance, and political scapegoating have exacerbated these issues, and arguably, I think, you know, have a greater effect on the security and health of these populations. So as many people know, and I think that's a line that I've said probably way too many times over the last few years, Lebanon is the largest per capita host of refugees in the world. And that is bearing in mind the large Palestinian refugee population in the country, as it should be. But of course, Syrian refugees are the largest refugee population in the country. So it's also, in addition to being a major refugee host, also a major destination country for migrant workers and migrant domestic workers in particular. Of course, Syrian refugees in the country also come, you know, amidst and following a long history that Sarah alluded to of Syrian migrant labor in the country that really started in the 1950s. So a lot of these categories that I'm talking about, you know, seem like they're clearly siloed and separate, but actually, you know, intersect in many ways as well. So there's also smaller migrant and refugee populations, including Iraqis, Sudanese, and also, you know, broader populations like Egyptians who have come to the country for labor migration. But most of the examples that I will draw upon really relate to three populations, primarily Syrians, Palestinians, and migrant domestic workers, primarily from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. So even prior to the explosion and to the deterioration of the Lebanese economy in the last year, migrants and refugees were among the most economically vulnerable populations in the country. the dollar crisis and the rapid inflation have greatly affected them, as it did with the majority of Lebanese who are paid in lira. So a big part of the devaluation of the lira has been related to its very long-standing peg to the US dollar, which I'm not going to go into great detail about, but effectively those who were paid in lira most acutely felt the deterioration of the economic crisis. And so in addition to that sort of financial precarity, there was also no protections for migrant labor in the country, and importantly, I would argue major restrictions on the forms of employment and the type of labor that migrant populations can do. And so effectively, even Palestinians who are often born in the country and have been living in the country for decades are restricted from formal work in the country, and so are much more subject to the sort of precarity of informal labor conditions, and to what I'll come to later, some of the restrictions, the challenges that poses when we come to lockdowns and restrictions on movement. So with the COVID-19 situation, there's been a number of intermittent lockdowns that have affected day laborers and informal workers in particular, and these have really had concentrated effects on migrant and refugee populations. In addition, over the last couple of months, what we've seen is a large increase in the number of migrant domestic workers that have found themselves abandoned by their employers and placed in front of embassies and often just by the sides of the roads, either abandoned by their employers themselves or escaping due to the increasingly abusive conditions and lack of pay, and that they're demanding that their embassies bring them home. So here I'd like to note something I think that intersects a little bit with what Sarah is saying, that so much of the analysis when we focus on Lebanon is either placed in a geopolitical lens that talks about Iran and talks about, or placed in kind of the internal dysfunction of the country, but we often forget that it's also implicated in all of these other structures, like very much a racialized and classed labor migration regime that makes it that Ethiopian migrants in Lebanon are not only left by the side of the road by their employers and face legal precarity from the Lebanese government, but also are abandoned by their own governments because they are a source of remittances and of major economic security for them. So, the implications of their home governments are also important to highlight here. And so while part of the challenge for these populations is definitely financial, and as I said, the economic crisis really affected them greatly, the much bigger and much more enduring challenge that they face is one of legal status and legal precarity. And the kafala system in particular, which is a system that we find also in the Arab Gulf, particularly with regards to migrant domestic workers, but also more broadly other categories of migrant work, which is broadly known as a sponsorship system. And that makes migrant domestic workers dependent on their employers, not only for their livelihoods, but also for their right to stay in the country, and importantly, these days, for their right to leave the country. And so this is why what we've seen is that migrant domestic worker activists and organizations that work with migrant domestic workers have actually focused immensely on the need to pressure Lebanese general security for blanket amnesties for migrant domestic workers, and for, again, the home embassies to provide means of travel, because often migrant domestic workers have their passports confiscated by their employers and are not able to leave the country without their legal cases expunged, and with means of, again, linking to what Sarah was saying, the involvement of visa regimes that make it such that they need, a passport to leave the country. So the plight of migrant domestic workers has become much more visible these days, but again, it's embedded into a much longer history. And this is an issue that specifically actually migrant-led organizations have really worked very hard to bring forward. And I think it's really important to recognize the work that they've done on this for the last decade really strongly. And to come back to the blast, I think it's important to note that in terms of its effect on these migrant groups, that even if we were to think about it from the perspective of those who were killed, a significant number of those who fell victim to or who were killed by the blast on August 4th were migrants and refugees in the country, but their presence in that disaster has been effectively erased by the Lebanese government, and there's been a real effort to not acknowledge the deaths of migrants and refugees within this crisis, but it's something that's come up time and time again. So, for instance, in the latest ISF, which is the Internal Security Forces of the country, report on the number of missing victims, they noted that of the 50 remaining missing, only 3 of Lebanese origin were still missing, and yet they didn't acknowledge any any nationalities or any other groups that were missing that remain missing in that tally. Although officially we know that at least 43 Syrians were among the victims, but this is from the records actually of the Syrian embassy. And so we of course know that there are issues with the documentation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and their association with the Syrian embassy. And so we can only assume that that's a severe underestimation of the number of victims that fell on August 4th. And in addition to the extrapolation that we can make from that, we also know that the neighborhoods that were in that blast radius that Sarah mentioned were also areas, especially the working class neighborhoods of Jaitewe and Karantina, were also places where migrants and refugees often lived and worked. So in addition to kind of the immediate effect of the blast, I want to talk a little bit about the relief efforts on the ground that came in the aftermath. And one of the ways I think, one of the incidents I think that's particularly remarkable in here is that in the immediate days that followed August 4th, the Palestinian Civil Defense came out to the streets to help with the post-blast debris removal, and there were immediately calls to have them leave the streets so that at least not visibly Palestinians would not be participating in this moment. And so I think there's really something to be reflected on there, in addition to the actual violence that was wrought on these populations, both historically and in this blast. There's also this attempt to erase them from any sense of reconstruction or rebuilding that seems to be primarily focused on in a national lens. And that may not altogether be surprising, but I think it points to some of the limits of relying on a purely kind of civil society or ad hoc relief effort. As much as we want to, that there are incredible efforts on the ground, it's also the case that these ad hoc civil society interventions can also be subject to some of the same limitations of discrimination and refugee scapegoating that we see elsewhere. So in terms of international relief efforts, what we've seen is a further consolidation of the segmentation between UNRWA and UNHCR, especially at a time when UNRWA has been gutted of all of its financing. And the former UNRWA is tasked with providing support for Palestinian refugees in particular, and the latter, UNHCR, for Syrians. And this has led to what Elena Fidian Tasminiye has called the consolidation of a hierarchy of worth and exclusion that has separated different groups of refugees on the basis of nationality and origin, and where we see the Syrian refugees really being pitted against Palestinian refugees in the international aid effort and the mobilization of aid abroad. And as we know from Sarah's work, it was actually the solidarity networks between Palestinians and Syrians early on that allowed Syrians to sort of navigate many of the complicated intricacies of Lebanese bureaucracy and health access. And a lot of these governance structures, including international aid dynamics, have actually continued to exacerbate tensions between Palestinian populations and Syrians living within Palestinian refugee camps. And finally, I just want to have a few words on the ways in which martial law, emergency measures, and curfews have had a disproportionate effect on migrant refugee populations. So in particular, there was a state of emergency that was declared in Beirut in the aftermath of the blast, and that had as an effect to, of course, limit the movement of all people in Beirut, but had a disproportionate effect on those who have irregular status. And Syrian refugees, in particular in Lebanon, are disproportionately do not have legal status in the country. And I can talk about why that's the case in the Q&A. But what that meant is that the presence of a militarized force and a martial law in Beirut meant that Syrian refugees that were caught moving beyond the hours that they were allowed, or even within the designated hours, merely by interacting with the military, were more likely to be detained and face potential legal consequences. And so in addition to what's been happening in Beirut, what we've seen is an extension of an existing practice that I document in my research, which is municipal curfews targeting Syrians across the country. And so what I saw in my own work is that really we see a spike in the number of discriminatory municipal curfews targeting Syrians in late 2014. But we see this phenomenon kind of plateauing in 2016, 2017. What's been really remarkable, not necessarily in a, not in a positive way, but kind of to be remarked, is that the number of curfews has really proliferated in the aftermath of the blast, but also of COVID-19. And there's been a number of municipalities, over a dozen, that have specifically called for curfews targeting migrant populations. And I think it's important to note here that in my own work, I find that these curfews are much more about projecting a sense of order and governing authority within these jurisdictions than they are truly about, regulating the presence of Syrians. And similarly, even though I haven't been back to Lebanon since the beginning of the crisis, or of this particular crisis, my sense is that these new COVID security measures are much more about kind of jurisdictional projection of authority than they are about effective public health measures. Because as we know, this is not a virus that discriminates based on nationality. We've also seen, of course, lockdowns of Palestinian refugee camps, both by Palestinian camp authorities as well as by Lebanese security forces. And these have re-entrenched the camp and those who live in it as sort of a source of insecurity, right? The image of the camp as a source of insecurity has kind of reemerged. Not that it ever really disappeared, I think, in Lebanon. And this is despite the fact that we have no evidence of the disproportionate spread of the virus among refugee populations. So it's important to note that actually the major clusters in Lebanon have actually come from Lebanese coming back from abroad. And so all of these things are happening within the backdrop of an increasingly hostile situation in the country for migrants and refugees. And while one of the truly remarkable events, I think, of the October 17th movement and the protests was really the widespread rejection of the scapegoating rhetoric advanced by politicians, most notably Gibran Bassil and the FPM. There's a danger, I think, that this moment harbors a much more kind of insidious danger of effectively mobilizing anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiments in the country. Although it's also the case, and this is, I think, again, to cap it off to some of Sarah's comments, that I think many Lebanese now are finding themselves in similar situations that Syrian refugees and Palestinians in the country have found themselves in for decades. And the recent news of a Lebanese family, who lost their child trying to escape on a boat in the Mediterranean, I think is really indicative of the ways in which the realities of many Lebanese today cannot be readily distinguished from those of other migrants and refugees in the country. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the further discussion.
Thank you so much, Lama. The politics of migrant and refugee erasure are really important. I'm hoping that we get to chat about the relationship between that and what's going on in Syria in the Q&A. And so lastly, we have Jean Lachapelle.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's really a pleasure to be among this distinguished list of speakers. So I'll be talking about Lebanon from a slightly different perspective as someone who's done research in Egypt and whose work focuses mostly on Egypt and Algeria. So what I want to do in this presentation is put the current economic and political crisis in a broader context of the wave of protests that occurred across the Arab world since 2018 and 2019, and which have echoes in previous waves of protests during the Arab Spring. So the current protests in Lebanon have their own domestic underpinnings that have been discussed by the other panelists. There's inflation, unemployment, and this tragic explosion that happened in August. But they're also part of a broader phenomenon of large-scale mobilization that we've seen for about 2 years that have caused some leadership and even regime change in some countries. So in Algeria, large-scale protests ousted the aging president Bouteflika, preventing him from running for a 5th term after almost 20 years in power, a major development. He had been the candidate of the military, which has been controlling the country since independence. Likewise, in Sudan, a large-scale movement ousted Omar al-Bashir, who had been in power for 30 years after he seized power in a coup in 1989 and imposed his personalist dictatorship. So there are interesting similarities between these other protests, which occurred not only in Algeria, in Sudan, but also in Egypt, Iraq, and other places, and the ones in Lebanon. So the protesters in Lebanon have used some similar languages and repertoires. So they have themselves drawn parallels between these uprisings and the ones that they are doing, so they've referred to the movement as a revolution, thawra, which is a term that became very prominent after 2010 across the Arab world. And indeed, in the fall of 2019, protesters raised this statue in Martyr Square of a clenched fist with the word revolution written on it, drawing these parallels and inscribing the movement in a broader phenomenon in the region. Second, it appears that protesters have assimilated many of the lessons from the previous waves of protests in the Middle East and North Africa. And in particular, the lesson that the more divided the protesters are, the easier it is for the people in power to maintain the status quo. And that therefore, protesters should strive for unity. The harmful consequences of social divisions are clear. In Egypt, for instance, between 2011 and 2013, the increasing polarization between Islamists and non-Islamists opened the way for the military to capture power in a coup in 2013 and consolidate authoritarian rule and essentially cancel the democratic experiment. This was the case also in Algeria in the 1990s, where a similar situation created the conditions for a coup and the cancellation of legislative elections. So based on these experiences, there seems to be a realization in Lebanon and more broadly that opposition movements should beware of efforts to divide them. And yet, of course, the Lebanese context appears to me very different from all these other cases that I've studied, and I'll be curious to hear more what the panelists think. For one, as Christiana mentioned, Lebanon is an electoral democracy. So when people chant, people want the downfall of the regime, what they mean by regime is very different from what was meant in other Arab countries in recent years. In Sudan, the regime was basically Omar al-Bashir, and as it was a very personalized regime. In Algeria, the regime is this military intelligence complex that stood behind Bouteflika. And in Egypt in 2011, the regime meant, at the time, Mubarak, his clique, the ruling party, and the clientelist networks that the party sustained. So in many of these countries, we saw, where we saw regime or leadership change, we often had authoritarian regimes with highly personalized power. And that allowed protesters to identify a clear target for their demands, create a focal point for mobilization, and also assess some early success in the protest movement, because once the leader steps down, this is a very visible sign that they're making progress. Although I would submit that this recent history has proven that this is unfortunately the easiest part of deep reform, is ousting the leader. So in Lebanon, the regime does not consist of a cohesive group or one ruling coalition. Instead, it consists of different groups who share power but have control over their own clientelist networks. As Christiana explained, she referred to it as a party cartel. So it's a system that has deep roots that I won't get into, but roots in the post-Civil War settlement, and also deeper roots in the deeper colonial origins. So rather than seeking the downfall of one ruling group, the protesters have asked recently the removal of the entire political class and an end to sectarian power sharing, which would involve very, very deep reform, and much deeper than the ouster of a particular ruling group, which creates challenges. And I'd like to mention another important point that is very different in Lebanon. So many things are so different, but that's the much less central role of a military as an actor who can perform the role of an arbiter, as has been the case in a lot of these other mobilizations. So in Algeria and Sudan recently, but also in Egypt and Tunisia back in 2011, the most important actor that determined whether there would be a regime breakdown or survival was the military. And when the military chose that ousting the incumbent was preferable, this is when a transition started. And in many of these cases, the military has played an active role in shaping the post-regime breakdown trajectory, especially right now in Sudan and Algeria, where civilians have to constantly pressure the military to enact reforms, even after the ouster of the head of state. So in many cases, it's the military that determines the pace and nature of political reform, including the timing of election, which eventually determines the balance of powers at the end of the transition. And in some cases, the military can choose to cancel the whole thing if they think that reform goes too far and might threaten its interests. And again, in Lebanon, the situation is very different because of the absence of a cohesive military organization that could act as a coherent actor. The Lebanese armed forces don't have a monopoly on violence over the country, and the protesters don't have a single military interlocutor to engage with. And it might sound like an obstacle for reform, but at the same time, given the recent history of the role that the military played in the region, I would submit that there's something almost encouraging there, given that there's no one single actor with deeply entrenched interests that could spoil reform. So perhaps, and I'm going to finish with this hopeful note, Lebanon's more fractured environment might not only create obstacles for reform, but also there might be opportunities that are not present in other contexts, given that it's very hard for one single group to monopolize power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, so we are now at the Q&A section of the panel. We have plenty of time, which is great. The bad news is that I have insufficient questions from all of you. I know many of you who are watching, you all should ask questions. You're smart people. I know you have questions. I do have a couple questions, so no immediate pressure, but you should definitely make sure to get your questions in. So I'm going to take a prerogative as moderator and ask a question of my own that actually also came in from Dan Slater for Christiana, which is about this kind of party co-optation of opposition protests. So isn't this kind of transparent to the opposition, given that they're seeking this like non-partisan or maybe super partisan reform to the system? So Dan wants to know, kind of relatedly, are there political elites in Lebanon that are trying to establish themselves outside or beyond the party cartel to perhaps like try to escape this all of them means all of them framing, or are they just busy trying to undermine that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks to Dan for that question. I would say that all of the key members of this party cartel are attempting to sort of co-opt the protest movement in a way that may indeed be very transparent to the reformist class, and indeed to broad swaths of the Lebanese population writ large. And yet they're trying to do so. And I think there is some evidence that it's at least partially successful. And I think I would divide my answer as to how they're doing that into two sort of separate components. I mean, the first is this sort of discourse of blame shifting in combination with actively encouraging supporters to protest. One of the common refrains that I heard when I came into Lebanon in November 2019 and January 2020 was that, you know, leader X is corrupt. We know this, and these protests have made it even clearer, but he's not as corrupt as leader Y. And this discourse, this sort of shifting the discursive focus of blame onto other party cartel members may in part be a function of the fact that all of these parties are sort of representing an ascriptive identity. And these are identities that for many reasons, as Jean mentioned, are deeply rooted you know, in a variety of legacies, including colonial legacies. People value them. And so, you know, this is a rhetoric that elites in Lebanon fall back on time and time again, this sort of blame shifting with a sectarian tone. I would also say that some party cartel members have, not necessarily as per Dan's question, you know, made credible promises to provide better public goods, but have made sort of taken costly action to signal that they want to be different from the rest of the elite class. You know, the Lebanese forces in the Kataib did resign from parliament, and they, along with the Future Movement, did not participate in the government of Hassan Diab. And so while I'm not saying that that's anything other than a strategic move, and these parties are certainly still part of the cartel in a broad sense, this is another way in which certain members of the cartel are attempting to signal that they are different. So in short, everybody is doing this. And I think it really remains to be seen the extent to which Lebanese find this credible at the ballot box, you know?
Got it. Politics of blame shifting is never ending.
Can I add something to that, Matthew?
Please.
Just in thinking about this, I think it's really Christiana, what Christiana said is very apt. But one of the ways I think that is important to highlight, and I think comes out a little bit in Sarah's presentation as well, is that one of the strategies is also about temporality. I think it's really about defining so much, I think, of the effort of, I don't think that means meaningful to talk about an opposition in Lebanon. I think Christiana's framing is much more accurate to say it's a party cartel that doesn't truly have an opposition, but has been about defining when did the quote unquote crisis begin? What is the crisis? And therefore, who can be blamed for it, right? So I think you're right that to a certain degree, the Kataib and the Lebanese forces, more so, I think even the Kataib have been doing this work for a longer period and trying to distance themselves from the major ruling class, partly because they've been excluded from it. That's also the truth, right? So, but I think it's really about demarcating this. And I think so much of the effort of Lebanese activists on the ground, of scholars in Lebanon, has been about reinforcing this idea that this is not something that began, on August 4th, nor is it even something that started in 2017, nor is it something that started, right? So thinking about the temporality of this, I think, is also part of the strategy that parties have employed and that people have worked against.
Okay. Omama Kubli, who's a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, has a question for Sarah about what safety measures has the Lebanese government adopted post the explosion in regards to kind of like the handling of explosive chemicals. Have they made any reforms in this regard, or is it just kind of like a, well, whoops, like it's too late now type situation?
So here's the thing, and we can talk about this more in class tomorrow, but one thing that I think we should start by thinking about, I don't know. It is not ignorance of what proper storage procedures are that caused this explosion. It is not ignorance that ammonium nitrate is dangerous that caused this explosion. right? We're thinking about, or what I would encourage people to do is think about a larger system that places the port that brings in 75% of imported goods to Lebanon as basically a lootable resource that these members of the party cartel have systematically divided up since, you know, the early 1970s, right? It doesn't matter if there are safety regulations because they can be skirted. It doesn't matter if if a ship isn't allowed to dock at harbor because someone can be bribed. We're talking about a larger system that has basically been systematically rendered vulnerable to actors who will use it to their own ends. And that's, I mean, that's why people are saying kullun yani kullun, right? Like, it's not like firefighters didn't know if they had seen, it's like a yellow placard with a little circle and flames on top of it for an oxidizer thing. It's not like firefighters didn't know what that meant. It's not like there aren't brilliant chemical engineers in Lebanon. It's that you have a party system and you have a system of governance that not only is more interested, that is focused upon basically profiting to any extent possible, but that I think if I could screen share again, I would put up ALAMEDDINE's quote again, which is to say that this is an accident that occurred because no one in government, no one with any responsibility for the care and well-being of Lebanon and its people cares. And I think that's the big part of what protesters are getting at. And that's why it doesn't matter if certain parties sort of adopt these measures or these practices or quit the government or whatever. It's because people see the entire system as not just rotten, but as fundamentally not caring about them, right? People know it's the same thing with building regulations, for example. Like, we could even go into the fact that like so many of the buildings that collapsed were probably not built to code because developers can skirt all of the building regulations as it is, right? It's fundamentally about sort of that core social contract of a government is supposed to care about you. And that's not the situation that most Lebanese feel that they are living in.
Would any of the other panelists like to chime in on that? If not, I have a follow-up for you guys. So I am really struggling to remember I cannot remember the author of this article. It came out a couple years ago about the politics of delay. So delay being a strategy that autocrats use to basically wait out popular mobilization. And I'm really curious for what the panelists think about, kind of related to what Sarah's just said about how the government just does not care about these people, and it's transparent that the government doesn't care, and it's just going to sit there and not care until what, like, is it possible for the government to just, like the party cartel, to just wait this out? Or do we think that this is not something they're going to be able to just slog their way through?
It might be, Matthew, the politics of ignoring. Is it possible?
That's the one. Exactly. You got it.
Yeah.
I could say something to that. I mean, again, not to be kind of resounding the same horn, but I think this is also not new in Lebanon, right? I mean, I've argued that, in regards to refugee policy, that like Lebanese policy has been a politics of inaction for a very long time, and others have made this argument not only with regards to refugee policy, but also, in other areas. And I think there has definitely been an effort to, there's been the party cartel in Lebanon we're all kind of using this language now, but the party cartel in Lebanon has often made use of the fact that there has been strong geopolitical interest in Lebanon, and has, as much as, France, the US, and other, Western countries have been invested in ensuring that, Lebanon and Hezbollah, the dynamics of Hezbollah are contained in Lebanon, and that their, patrons are, in power or are able to lead in the country. The political parties in Lebanon have also been very aware of their utility to their main patrons. And so there's always been this sense that, if all else fails, we can rely on these external patrons to bail us out because they need us just like we need them. And the question is really whether, considering the state of kind of broadly geopolitics right now, whether that will be true, right? I think, you know, the visit of Macron was very much an indication of that, this idea of the French kind of coming back to revive an old colonial, you know, relationship. But, and obviously, of course, with the US election, there's lots of speculation that this, you know, this may not get resolved until we see the outcome of November 3rd, right? So there's ways in which I think, you know, this, again, this politics of inaction or politics of delay, as you called it, whatever, is also tied in with the ways in which governance has happened in Lebanon basically since the end of the Civil War, always with these kind of major conferences that bring together all of the parties that are, you know, brought out with some sort of international patron, different ones at different times. So the question is really like, is that possible today? Is that going to happen? Are they going to get saved? And if so, if not, then what are the resources that they're going to be able to use to continue to stay in power, right? So as much as it's a really kind of depressing situation economically in the country, and the you know, the resources are, there's also a space for thinking creatively about what this will mean, also about eradicating the resources that also the parties themselves have access to. So, I mean, briefly, we don't know, right? But I think this is not entirely, you know, new in the country, but I think we're seeing a different set of circumstances today that may lead to different outcomes.
Okay, I'm starting to get a couple other questions, predictably around the big scary R word of reform. So everybody wants to know how are we going to reform? So particularly this question from Elza Harb, who is a Lebanese citizen and wants to know, you know, what should the protests do to move beyond just protests? And recognizing that this is a difficult question, like we're attempting to figure out, I guess, how to chart a course forward. And I think I would kind of add to this, if, you know, let's presume generously that international actors actually care about Lebanese citizens as people and not just as whatever geopolitical tool is going on, which is an assumption that is, you know, pretty quickly not met. But even if we were to assume that would be the case, what should we be thinking about doing to try and alleviate some of the difficulties that Lebanon has been going through? Which brave panelist wants to take on that one first?
I mean, I can answer this very briefly, although I'm interested in Lama's thoughts, given that she is a Lebanese citizen as well. You know, and I am not, and I think, to be honest, echoing some of Sarah's thoughts, it's really not incumbent upon foreigners observing from the outside to tell Lebanese how to reform or how to behave in a protest context. I think Lebanese have already mobilized consistently amidst really, really terrible circumstances in a way that is incredibly impressive. And I think a lot of it involves just, you know, this protest mobilization continuing, and it continues every day in some form or another. You know, one path forward that I've heard Lebanese discuss is the potential of early elections. Granted, there's significant disagreement over whether there should be a new electoral law and other institutional aspects like that. But assuming there are early elections, you know, one would hope to see the development of a sort of party-like apparatus that allows reformists to win, you know, that allows them to win enough seats to constitute a formidable parliamentary opposition. And, you know, I think that's probably an optimistic scenario for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is that I would never assume the international community to ever actually support these aspirations. And I don't think they will moving forward. And I don't think either the American or French presence in Lebanon in recent months has demonstrated that they will do that. So I think Lebanese will have to come up with creative solutions in spite of international intervention and probably not because of it. So yeah, sorry to end on that. I guess that's a bit optimistic, but also a bit pessimistic.
I might jump in with, I really like to echo that statement, in that it is absolutely not my business to tell Lebanese protesters what or how or why. They're capable of handling this quite on their own and have been for, you know, years/decades. What I do think it's important to note is that if people are interested in helping, and both Lama and I have the lists of independent organizations, one of the points that Lama brought up is that aid is not uncomplicated when it comes to Lebanon, that many organizations are either affiliated with the parties or have sort of their own sectarian roots. And one of the things that has come up again and again in the aftermath of the explosion specifically is that many Lebanese protesters or just Lebanese citizens don't want money going through their government. People are extraordinarily aware of the fact that anything that goes into government coffers will probably be lost in the sense of someone on the who's supposed to be on the receiving end getting it. So it's really important if you do want to help or if you do want to advocate or that sort of thing, and this actually goes for members of the Lebanese diaspora as well, to be really careful where you're sending your money and to whom, and to think through what really matters and what communities are suffering the most and where sort of those holes in aid might be. And I think Lama has the link. I can probably find it as well if we want to share that, but I think it's a good thing to say about sort of any disaster or crisis, to really know what the ways to help are that are respectful of what people on the ground want. And Lebanese protesters specifically have repeatedly said, like, don't send money through the government, send this through vetted independent organizations. And if you don't know what those are, reference one of the lists that's been going around.
I mean, and I'll add just one little point there to say, absolutely, we can share that list. But one thing that is, something to bear in mind, I think having this entire conversation and not talking about the banks and the kind of hold on capital in the country is we'd be remiss to do that. And I think actually one of the challenges that's come up over the last even month, in the immediate aftermath of the blast, there was a bit of a respite, and banks were allowing a lot of organizations that were working on the ground to access money. But there's been a kind of a re-clampdown on, there's been reports of even the Lebanese Red Cross having difficulties accessing their funds within the Lebanese banking sector. And so there's also a kind of a political question around also what kind of global kind of capitalist system in Lebanon, and we're sort of, Western states are supporting and continuing to. So for instance, there's been calls by Lebanese expats, I think particularly there's been a lot of activism in New York on tracing the money of Lebanese bankers abroad that have been brought to the United States and putting pressure to extend the sort of sanction type logic that is often used in Lebanon only for geopolitical reasons, for instance, to sanction people close to Hezbollah or allies or members of Hezbollah abroad, to extend that same logic. Now, I have mixed views on this, but I think it has been something that has come up a lot, to extend the sort of the tools of sanctions to also be used against Lebanese politicians and their funds abroad, but as well as Lebanese bankers that have effectively stolen the wealth of regular Lebanese, both working class and middle class Lebanese. So I think there's a whole lot to be said about that, but I think that is something that politically I think is worth talking about. And effectively, I think one of the challenges with this, as much as it's necessary to provide immediate aid and the immediate needs are immense, the reality is that most Lebanese want a state, right? I think this is something that I think often gets lost in the conversation. And, there's this idea that most Lebanese do not want this particular, manifestation of the state and this, this party cartel. But it's also not the case that people want to live in a civil society-led, so it's also important to think about what are the political leverages that we have, and what can be used, not to prop up party cartels, as often Western states have been known to do, but to actually potentially use some of those same tools to actually affect change to the real political levers in the country.
All right, so Jem has a question for John, which is kind of building off of this last comment that you made about kind of one of the main differences being between the Lebanese revolution and some of the other recent revolutions in the Middle East being the role of the military. So Jem wants you to kind of re-articulate or go further into why a division of power might produce a better outcome. That was like an interesting insight that I had not thought of yet too. So I'm curious for your thoughts here. What exactly, like, could you tease out why you think that kind of fragmented power would make real reform more feasible?
Yes, thank you for this question. So this is a question that refers to the potential for reform. So I'll start also with the caveat that it is not my role to say what needs to be done. And the question speaks to the problems with having a weak state, as in Lebanon, which is a very different problem. I think my comment was, I was trying to highlight some of the obstacles that seem to plague a lot of efforts for reform in a lot of countries in the Arab world. And in Lebanon, it seems like the set of challenges is different. So I was highlighting some of the, maybe highlighting that having a strong state is not necessarily a panacea if one group is able to capture the state. So there's relatively more ability for in Lebanon. There's relatively more freedom than in a regime where things are completely closed. There's no one secret police that controls the entire country. So these are some of the, some of the positive things. It's very difficult to come up with like a specific reforms, especially for me as a student of authoritarianism in the region. When the state is very weak, the challenges are very different. So I was basically trying to highlight some of the and on a mostly positive note, and this is it's a very difficult environment.
Is it okay if I just add a little bit to that? Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jean's sentiments that the repressive apparatus and things like media censorship look different in Lebanon, perhaps, than in other Middle Eastern states, although I wouldn't characterize the repressive apparatus as kind in Lebanon, particularly in the last couple years in the wake of the protests. I would also add that there's a lot of really interesting work being done about this discourse of weak stateness in Lebanon. People like Jamil Muawad and Walid Hasbun have published really interesting work about how what looks like a weak state in the conventional, I would say largely Western framing, is actually underscoring a system that is much more resilient. And that, in fact, even though, for example, security institutions are fragmented across sectarian groups and even between the state and non-state actors, that those groups aren't actually checking one another in ways that actually hold one another accountable. So the various political parties like the Future Movement and Hezbollah and Amal that are deeply involved in security provision, for example, are not holding one another accountable. They're collaborating, they're cooperating. So I would just add that, of course, the security sector in Lebanon does look different, but in another sense, it's collaborative and collusive in a way that more closely resembles other regional counterparts.
So we have a couple kind of partial questions that the question part of the comments have been answered, but I'll mention the comment, which is that a number of attendees really liked Sarah's framing of, I guess, the disaster aftershocks as being a really compelling way to understand what is going on in Lebanon. And I also agreed with that. I'm gonna have to think about that for a long time as to a way to understand both the kind of historical aspect of what's going on, that it's a longue durée thing, that this didn't just happen, and that it will continue to reverberate into the future. I think people liked that a lot.
Just to be clear, not my framing, Gary Marbonillas, who's an anthropologist of Puerto Rico.
Got it, interesting. I can see that resonates. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. This is just a generic question from Dries Magraoui about how reliable should we take statistics about deaths and missing people? I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at that, but I do not have a good answer.
I mean, I can take a stab at that, I guess, just because I'm the one who cited cases of, at least of missing people. I think Sarah mentioned case of deaths. I mean, they're not reliable in the sense that they're not certain, in the sense they're clearly underrepresenting the phenomenon. And part of that is due to, you know, again, the number of people who are undocumented in different ways in the country, but also just, you know, both, you know, benign neglect, but also just the malice of, I mean, I think the actual effort of the Lebanese state to do recovery of, you know, people who were missing in the rubble lasted less than a week, from what I recall. I think it was 6 days exactly. And then they were like, okay, I think we're done looking now. And obviously that was not sufficient, and there were still people, I mean, there was a very intense, like 72 hours that some of us may have experienced where there was a Chilean rescue team in Lebanon that had, anyways, very long story, but the point is that there was the possibility of a potential body still under the rubble a month after the explosion, and it became both metaphorically, you know, and really kind of powerfully like I think a symbol of the Lebanese state and kind of the Lebanese movement, you know, for change, because there was all of this effort to try to find the missing body, but ultimately amounted to nothing. There was no body, even though they kept sensing a pulse or a heartbeat. So all that to say that there's a lot of uncertainty still around whether other people remain missing, whether there's people who are unaccounted for, especially in that area. There's a lot of us who have spent time in that area know that there were lots of children, Syrian children primarily, who were, you know, who would work young, you know, and it's not clear whether they were, some of them were orphans, some of them were not. So whether anyone would have actually accounted for them being missing. So of course they're unreliable, but they give us, you know, that's the case, you know, it's like when people always ask me, like, are the COVID-19 numbers reliable in Lebanon? I'm like, of course they're not, but they're not reliable basically anywhere. They're definitely not reliable in the United States. And so, you know, I think it's always important to take statistics and figures like this in, you know, with a grain of salt, but to also think about, you know, why are certain, you know, populations maybe more missing than others, who is more likely to be missed? What is, you know, what does it tell us about who matters and who matters to whom? And so those are the kinds of things that I like to highlight when I talk about the figures, and rather than fixating on a particular number. But it does give us a sense of scale. But I think everybody agrees that the number is probably underrepresenting.
I can sort of jump in here too, and I might actually do the thing and share my screen for like 2 seconds if people will like put up with me, which I'm going to make you because now I have you trapped. Haha. So let's just look really quickly back at this slide. So if we look at, if the previous slide was that sort of radius, this is a neighborhood in Jaitawi, which is sort of an up and coming, but really historically a working class and largely Christian neighborhood. I took this picture in 2008. This was from my bedroom window, the only summer I lived in East Beirut, and it looks out on the container offloading part of the port, not the part where the ammonium nitrate was stored. That's on the other side of the building. But just to give you an idea of what these neighborhoods look like, this is a neighborhood that has witnessed significant construction in the decades since I lived there. And you're already looking at an extraordinarily dense set of buildings, which is really important to think about. Now, if we consider that, and I will let you stop looking at my screen now. But if you consider that along with the fact that it's almost impossible to keep track of people in Lebanon. And here are the reasons. First of all, many Lebanese live in Beirut without being registered as residing there because of the way the electoral laws work. So many of my neighbors in Jaitawi might have been from villages up in the mountains, but would not have been registered as such because of the way that various electoral laws and registration rules and family and sort of like family documentation rules work. Second, you have somewhere in the neighborhood of between 250 and 400,000 Palestinians in Lebanon who are registered with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. Some have immigrated. People have also given birth to families. There are also Palestinian refugees who are not documented. Then there are Syrian refugees, and only Bout and Lama knows these numbers better than I do, but to the best of my knowledge, when I was there studying sort of Syrian refugees between, you know, or when I was there and then began studying Syrian refugees between like 2012 and 2014, the sort of common knowledge was that UNHCR was only registering approximately 50% of Syrian refugees. Now you add to that the fact that many people are living in sort of informal settlement types of settings. And this is not to talk about the Palestinian refugee camps, for example, which have about, in some cases, doubled in size since the beginning of the Lebanese civil war. But like Lama mentioned, street children, people who are living on the street, which previously was not something you saw in Lebanon like a decade ago. A journalist, a Lebanese journalist has done a deep dive into examining the neighborhood of Karantina, which historically was actually where people coming in through the port were quarantined in the early 1900s, but where many sort of working class Syrian refugees, in the past Kurdish refugees and Palestinian refugees lived as well, which had a lot of informal housing and where people have suffered immensely from the explosion, but many were not documented, registered, or recorded. So thinking through what Lama is saying about how populations get masked, a lot of this is deliberate in the context of Lebanon. And that is extraordinarily important to remember. So do we know where people are? No, I can tell you that when I was sort of doing research for my talk, I can tell you that the first lieutenant who heads up the Karantina Fire Brigade basically said when we got onto site, the most we could find of the truck was the size of a palm. If that gives you an idea of the fact that things were just completely blown apart. So in that kind of setting, you're not gonna find everyone. But I think the bigger issue here is that there's no way to know who was there in the first place and that was deliberate as well.
Okay, so we are about out of time here. I want to give the panelists one last chance here if they have any questions for themselves or any burning thoughts that they want to express before we end here. I think I would like to give them the last word. And if not, that's totally fine. You guys have done an hour and a half of great work. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for attending. I learned a ton out of this. I'd also like to thank Derek and Dan for hosting and helping to organize. And I would like to thank the panelists and attendees for all coming. This was great. I hope you all learned a lot.